Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 290, Dricus Du Plessis defeated Robert Whitaker to cement himself as the #1 contender in the middleweight division. And as soon as Bruce Buffer finished up announcing Du Plessis as your winner, the UFC trotted in Israel Adesanya, the middleweight champion, to have an in-cage stare-down and confrontation with Dricus Du Plessis. And I believe this in-cage confrontation exposed a massive racial double standard amongst the MMA community. And I wanted to make a video pointing it out because it's just, I have to acknowledge these hypocrisies, especially when nobody else is willing to touch it. I guarantee there's other people who notice this. I guarantee there's other people who think this, but no one is willing to go out, put a video on their channel discussing this because they are worried about backlash. But guess what? To quote Dana White, that's not what we do here. So we're going to discuss the whole build-up between Adesanya Du Plessis. We're going to discuss whether or not the fight actually happens next, because that's kind of in question. And we're also going to discuss that I think there's something that Israel Adesanya is doing that is so painfully obvious that for some reason nobody is willing to even mention as well. But we're going to discuss all that in this video. You go back in time and you go into UFC 290, Dana White said, this is the #1 contender fight. We're making Robert Whitaker versus Dricus Du Plessis. Winner fights Israel Adesanya. But Dana White also said that the winner of that fight will fight Israel Adesanya at UFC 293, which is in early September. So essentially, whoever wins at UFC 293 has a 2-month turnaround, which is completely unfair in my opinion. But anyway, after Du Plessis wins against Robert Whitaker, people thought, oh, it's definitely going to be Adesanya Du Plessis. They did the stare down afterwards. But then last week, Israel Adesanya put out a video, and he essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, Du Plessis out with a foot injury, Sean Strickland's in, that's what's happening at UFC 293, and everybody ran with it. I talked about it, everyone ran with it. I made a video discussing that, and I said, look, Israel Adesanya is a credible source considering he's the champion in that fight. But who knows what his motives were with putting out that video. He could have been attempting Du Plessis to accept the fight when he's trying to figure out if he's going to be healthy or not, or trying to make the decision. There's plenty of reasons that Adesanya would have said that and it not be true. So my stance last week was, it might be Adesanya versus Strickland, but I find it hard to believe that Adesanya versus Du Plessis does not happen at UFC 293. And that is still my stance. I believe at UFC 293, we will get Israel Adesanya versus Dricus Du Plessis because the UFC is going to want to capitalize on this buildup between the two. Because say what you will, because I personally don't like the buildup, but this is a very unique buildup. This is a very weird buildup, and this is a buildup that we've never seen in the UFC before, which we're going to go over in a second. And I just find it hard to believe that the UFC isn't going to capitalize on that. And forget about the buildup. Dricus Du Plessis on this massive winning streak goes out there at UFC 290, has this huge TKO win over former champion Robert Whitaker. This is a compelling middleweight title fight, you know, in a middleweight division that's kind of been lackluster over the past years outside of the Alex Pereira fights. We finally actually have an interesting middleweight title fight where we think potentially the challenger in Du Plessis could get a win if he can beat Robert Whitaker. All bets are off against Israel Adesanya. So I just wanted to get that out of the way right away. I still do believe we will get Israel Adesanya versus Dricus Du Plessis at UFC 293. Now, if you jump into the backstory between Dricus Du Plessis and Israel Adesanya, you have to go all the way back to Du Plessis' UFC debut, because this is something that a lot of people got wrong. After Du Plessis' UFC debut against Marcus Perez, in his post-fight interview, I'm paraphrasing here, you know, because he said something like, I want to fight some guys in the top 20, but he said, I want to be the first real African champion. Okay, and when he said it at the time, nobody really cared. Nobody even thought about it too much. But then recently, earlier this year, when he was scheduled to fight Derek Brunson, he was doing some media, he was doing a press conference, he's more notable, he's on the path to a potential middleweight title shot. He was asked about, you know, the other African champions and Adesanya and Ngannou, something along those lines. I don't remember exactly what he was asked. But he said, look, did those belts ever go to Africa? I want to be the first African champion that takes the belt to Africa. Me and Cameron, we breathe African air. We wake up every day in Africa. And a lot of people took issue with this. A lot of people thought, okay, you know, he's saying he's the first real African champion, and he didn't actually say those words, but he heavily implied it. And in my opinion at the time, I never even made a video about it. I thought it was a little offhand. I thought it was a little petty. I thought it was a little bit strange because it doesn't matter if you wake up in Africa every day and breathe African air. If you were born there, you're still African. If I moved there tomorrow and I lived there for 2 days, I'm still African. So I just thought it was a weird angle, but I said, okay, Du Plessis is trying to generate some excitement for a future title fight against Israel Adesanya. He's just trying to conjure up this storyline. Well, then you fast forward to UFC 290, and you have Adesanya in the meantime saying, oh, he wants Dricus Du Plessis to win the fight against Robert Whittaker because he wants to fight him. And you have him making YouTube videos where he's talking about something, which we're going to talk about that in a second. He says certain things about Du Plessis that people take issue with. But then at UFC 290, it culminates with Du Plessis getting a big win over Robert Whittaker that not a lot of people expected. I would say 99% of people were counting Du Plessis out. So we almost thought all this build up and all this back and forth was going to be for nothing. But then Du Plessis pulls it off in the second round and just stops Robert Whittaker. Who would have ever imagined that craziness? And then they bring Israel Adesanya into the cage. And Israel Adesanya is drunk. Israel Adesanya is at the event just hanging out, and he has to be in the cage. And my guess is the UFC wanted to do that. So they bring Adesanya into the cage, and it's like this awkward WWE confrontation where Joe Rogan's trying to interview both of them. And essentially what you have, and you can go watch it for yourself, but essentially what you have is Adesanya saying, my African brother, over and over and over again. And then you have Du Plessis saying, you may be African, but you're no brother of mine. And then you have Adesanya saying, my N-word, my N-word, my N-word, over and over and over again, the N-word with the A on the end. And that's going to matter. We're going to talk about that later in the video as well. But then you have essentially Adesanya saying, well, why don't you go take a DNA test? And why don't you find out where your ancestors are from? Why don't you go take this DNA test so you can find out where you're really from? I know where I'm from. Essentially implying that Du Plessis' ancestors are not African and that Adesanya's ancestors are African. And it's this whole buildup that honestly I've tried to avoid talking about. But in this moment, I realized, well, really not in this moment, but in the days after this moment in the cage, I really realized there's a huge racial double standard here. Because the backlash that Israel Adesanya got for this cringy, awkward, weird, distasteful performance, if you call it that, in the cage, in this confrontation with Du Plessis, was, I couldn't believe the amount of people clutching their pearls over this. Israel Adesanya is a racist. How dare he use the N-word? Can you imagine if Du Plessis said that back to him? Could you imagine the outrage? And people were genuinely offended at the way Israel Adesanya acted. Now, my stance on this was essentially, look, I don't like it. I don't want to see it. It's WWE-esque. I don't like that about it. But it is what it is. It's not the biggest of deals. It's not like anyone really went crazy and crossed some line that you shouldn't cross. But I didn't like it. I made a video about it because people asked me to. I talked about it in my post-fight for UFC 290. I really did not like it. But the amount of people acting like this was the worst thing they ever heard in MMA was crazy to me. And don't get me wrong, there was people like me who just thought it was distasteful, who didn't like it. But there was a large portion of people talking about, yeah, Adesanya is so racist and Adesanya is so this. And they were clutching their pearls and they were so upset about it. And they were just clinging on. Adesanya said the N-word. Imagine if Du Plessis said that back to him. The level of outrage would be crazy. And that would be a double standard. And that's what they said. They say, oh, that'll be a double standard. If Dricus can't say it, we're going to talk about that later in the video as well. That's not the double standard I'm talking about. But I could not believe the outrage that Israel Adesanya garnered from his UFC 290 appearance with Dricus Du Plessis in the cage. And I started to think about it, and I said, what are some other times fighters have said outrageous stuff or gone a little crazy or maybe gone too far in their potential trash talk? And I thought of a couple examples. One was just a week prior from UFC 290, and it was Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland did a media day. He was a main event against Abus Magomedov, and Sean Strickland went out there and said, and again, I'm not exactly quoting him, but I'm paraphrasing what he said. He said, women shouldn't be able to work, women shouldn't be able to vote, and we should put women back in the kitchen. Well, what was the fan reaction to that? There was just crickets. Nobody cared at all. I said basically the same thing I said about Adesanya. I think it's distasteful. I don't like it. I don't want to hear it. But I was just shocked. There was nobody else. Everyone was like, oh, Sean Strickland's so funny. He's so hilarious. He's a comedian. That's people literally said that. He's a comedian. Well, he didn't say he was joking. He didn't say he wasn't being serious. So you had Strickland literally saying that women shouldn't work, women shouldn't vote, and women should be kept in the kitchen. And basically the fan base collective, yeah, Strickland, you're so right. This is so awesome. I'm glad you said what I've been thinking. That's kind of the reaction you got from the MMA community. Well, then I started thinking, well, who remembers when Colby Covington made fun of Matt Hughes? For those of you who don't know, Matt Hughes, former champion in the UFC, got hit by a train and suffered a traumatic brain injury, and Colby Covington made fun of him. And I believe it was a post-fight speech. He basically said something along the lines of, talking about one of the fighters that trained with Hughes. I don't remember the exact, circumstances around it, but basically saying, when the Colby train is coming, you better get off the tracks. You should have learned that from Matt Hughes. And I thought this was one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard. I mean, the guy can't move the same as he used to. He can't speak the way he used to. You can't interact with his family the same way he used to because he suffered a traumatic brain injury, and now you're making fun of him? I thought that was pretty disturbing. What was the fan reaction? There was a little bit of outrage, but for the most part, it was just crickets. Nobody really said all that much about it. And then I started thinking, what's another example? Oh, well, Conor McGregor. First off, punching an old man in the bar, that got a little bit of outrage. But Conor McGregor called Khabib's wife a towel because of the way she dresses, because of her religion, and because of where she's from. She wears, the stuff on her head that covers her face, and there's only one picture of her online. And Conor McGregor called her a towel. And people were like, oh, Conor's so funny. But then also Conor literally made fun of Khabib Nurmagomedov's dad dying. He tweeted out making fun of Khabib's dad dying. He said something along the lines of, because you have Khabib tweeting out something like, good will always triumph over evil. And Conor tweeted back to him something like, oh, the virus must be good and your dad must be evil, after his dad died. Again, there was a little bit of outrage, but not all that much. Oh, Conor's trying to lure him out of retirement. And for Colby, it was, well, Colby is just he's playing a character. That's always Colby's excuse. He's creating a character, and he's attempting to promote fights, and there was just nothing but excuses. So you have Sean Strickland, crickets, nothing. Conor McGregor, pretty much crickets and nothing. And Colby Covington, pretty much crickets and nothing. So I started to think about it. Well, what is the difference in those three instances and what Israel Adesanya did at UFC 290? And then I started looking at him and I'm like, oh, well, that's painfully obviously. Let's take a look at that. And I'm not saying, before somebody jumps down in the comments and saying that I'm saying this is the only reason, that is not what I'm saying. But I am acknowledging its existence. I don't think that acknowledging its existence means that it is the sole factor for why people are criticizing Israel Adesanya. I think a lot of people are just clutching their pearls because they don't like Adesanya. But you can't take into account that, oh, Strickland says this, Colby says this, McGregor says this, and this is just a list I came up with in 2 minutes off the top of my head. But then Adesanya acts like this. And if I had to rank them all, I'd put Adesanya at the bottom of the list. Now, for comparison, my reaction to all of them has basically been, this is distasteful, I don't like it, but it is what it is. What are you going to do? You're going to cut them? You're going to fine them? The UFC isn't going to do anything. And, I don't necessarily I'm not imploring the UFC to necessarily do anything. So that's been my reaction. My reaction has been consistent, but what became obvious to me is the fans' reactions, the MMA community's reactions. Crickets for Sean Strickland and women, crickets for Colby Covington and somebody with a traumatic brain injury from a terrible accident, crickets for McGregor making fun of somebody's wife and his dad that passed away. But Israel Adesanya says the N-word with the A on the end, all of a sudden, I mean, it's the end of the world. Adesanya needs to be cut. Adesanya needs to be fired. I'm not saying people said that, but people were going crazy and acting like it's the most offensive thing they ever saw in the entire MMA landscape ever. And I do believe that race is a component to that reaction. Again, I'm not saying it's 100% across the board, because there's people that just dislike Adesanya and they just want to find a way to criticize him as much as possible. But it's just crazy to me the amount of backlash he got for this. And people kept saying, oh, he said the N-word. He said the N-word. If Du Plessis said it, oh, could you imagine what would happen? Let me just say this first off, okay? If Du Plessis said the N-word with the A on the end and Dana White thought it was profitable, Dana White would be like, say it a couple more times if he thought it was profitable. Second off, I hate how people say that. And they're like, oh, it's a double standard. Adesanya can say it, but Du Plessis can't because Adesanya is black. And then you had Dana White was asked about it afterwards. And Dana White said he's black, he can say whatever he wants. But what he meant was he's black, he can say the N-word if he wants. He can say it. I don't care because he is black. And that's kind of the unwritten societal rule. And what I find really preposterous about this, the people who are saying this, primarily white people, do you want to say the N-word that badly? Like, do you wake up every day Yeah, I really want to say the N-word today. Maybe the one with the A, maybe the one with the hard R at the end. I'm really looking forward to using that in my day-to-day language. Unfortunately, I can't because people look down on those uses of those words because I'm white. Is that really what you want to do? Is that how you wake up every day? So I just don't get that argument in general because the historical context of that, like, do I really got to spell it out for you why black people are allowed to say the N-word but white people aren't? If I have to break down the historical context, I think you need more help than I can give you on an MMA YouTube channel. Seriously, you need to go seek mental health. I really do believe that because, I mean, it's just so clear. It's so black and white. It's not even funny. And people were saying Adesanya gets to say it, but Du Plessis doesn't. And then when there was talk of the Adesanya and Strickland matchup, they were like, yeah, Strickland will say it back. And they were cheerleading this type of behavior. They were like, oh yeah, I hope Strickland says the N-word back to him. I find it so bizarre how these people latch onto these narratives. And don't get me wrong, there are people on both sides who latch on to different narratives, but the amount of people in the MMA community who are latching onto this African and real African race narrative and being so defensive over Du Plessis in terms of saying Adesanya is being racist, and we're going to talk about the dreaded C word here in a second, but Adesanya is being racist towards Du Plessis. These are the same people that if you ever mention racism existing in MMA, they get angry. If you mention racism existing towards minorities in MMA, I've mentioned it in like 2 videos for probably less than a minute and a half, and I've gotten so many comments complaining. So many comments were literally held for review by YouTube because they were so egregious. So these same people who clutch their pearls and get all upset anytime you mention any racism towards minorities in MMA, now all of a sudden, oh, there might be something that's a little bit racist towards Dricus Du Plessis, who's a white man. Oh, I'm ready to jump to his defense. And let me just say this, and I said it before in another video that I got a lot of flack for. Racism exists in MMA from all walks of life, whether it's black people being racist against white people being racist against black people, Brazilians being racist against white or black people, whatever you want to say, ethnicities, different countries. There is stuff that goes on where people show a clear prejudice. But what I will say is the majority of MMA fans are white. It is primarily white. So even if you want to say every single community is equally as racist, and let's say it's a low percent, let's say it's 1%, by nature, that group of white people who is primarily the fan base is going to be a larger number in general. But these same people are ready just to latch onto this narrative and be like, well, Dricus Du Plessis, he's from Africa and he grew up in Africa, so he's more African. People have been saying that. I've been seeing this in my chat, and it's like, give it a rest. Who cares? Again, I don't even think that Du Plessis really meant anything crazy by what he said, but the amount of people that are willing to criticize Adesanya nonstop, all because he said the N-word with the A on the end. And meanwhile, they give Colby a pass, McGregor a pass, and, you know, you have the instance where it's just ridiculous. The Sean Strickland women, you know, debacle from literally a month ago. They give him a pass. They say he's a comedian. And meanwhile, they're just criticizing Adesanya and they're jumping to Dricus Du Plessis' defense. And then you had, and this was like a month before UFC 290, you had the whole C-word debacle. Adesanya called Dricus Du Plessis a cracker. And people said, oh, he used the C-word. Can you believe it? This is a racial slur. By definition, the word cracker is a racial slur. I also don't think Adesanya should have said it. I think it's cringy. I think it's a bit distasteful. But let's be honest here. Let's operate in reality. No one in the world is offended by the word cracker. People who say they are lying and pretending. And people who are calling it the C word are absolute embarrassments. Absolute embarrassments to act like anybody in the history of man has ever been offended by the C word. And even Du Plessis himself isn't offended. Du Plessis doesn't care. Du Plessis is just, oh, I want my middleweight title fight. He can call me whatever he wants. I'm not offended by that. And this subset of fan base is so just obsessed with this whole race narrative. I've tried to avoid it the whole time because I literally do not want to even talk about it. I just don't want this narrative. This is WWE-esque. This is something where you have Adesanya, where he's saying certain things that are distasteful and cringy. Du Plessis is making offhand comments that he probably shouldn't make, but it's not really, he's not really crossing the line like crazy. And meanwhile, you just have people just up in arms going crazy over both sides. And I just think it's completely ridiculous. I didn't want to have to make this video, but I just think it's completely ridiculous the amount of backlash that Israel Adesanya is getting. Meanwhile, Sean Strickland gets a complete pass. And these same type of people who are now hating on Israel Adesanya, but yet love Sean Strickland and say he's so funny, these are the same type of people that absolutely get no women ever. You know, they're like, yeah, I wish it would go back to the 1940s. I would love that. I could just kidnap a woman off the street and throw her into my kitchen. These are the type of people who defend Sean Strickland. I even mentioned, like, look, I don't like what Sean Strickland said. I thought it was distasteful. People had a field day. Like, what are you crying about this? I barely even talked about it. I didn't even make a video about it. And these people were so upset that I even suggested what Strickland said was distasteful. And I just think this exposed a massive double standard based on race in the community. Again, there might be other reasons. You don't like Adesanya, fair enough. You think he's cringy, fair enough. But if you really look at what he said and what he's done, it's not that big of a deal. If you really look at what Dricus Du Plessis said and has done, it's not that big of a deal. Again, both are distasteful. Neither one I particularly enjoy. Neither one I even want to see. You know, I hate this buildup. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, because what's so painfully obvious here, and people for some reason don't get it, they give Colby the out, they give McGregor the out. Israel Adesanya is just promoting a fight. And that, again, that's not an excuse not to criticize, but to clutch your pearls this hard. Meanwhile, again, these same people were defending Dana White for slapping his wife in a club at 53 in Mexico. These same people were defending him. Oh, he hit her first, blah, blah, blah. It's on video. He's hitting his wife. He's slapping his wife in a club in Mexico at 53 years old. You're defending that. But now all of a sudden, Adesanya, oh, it's the worst thing you've ever seen. It's how dare he say the N-word with the A on the end in reference to Dricus. And, you know, then you come to the defense of Sean Strickland. You have to come to the defense of Sean Strickland. Oh, that's just Sean being Sean. It's ridiculous. These guys are just promoting a fight. It may be cringy. It may be WWE-esque, but that's all Israel Adesanya is doing. Maybe he took it a little bit personal when Dricus said, oh, did those belts really go to Africa? Which was an offhand comment. Maybe he did take it a little bit personal. But at the end of the day, he just wants this fight to promote his legacy. He wants this fight because he looks at Dricus Du Plessis as a potential easy matchup for him, and a fight that, oh, this is going to get a lot of people's attention because of this whole race narrative. Let's drum it up. And then when the fight sells 1 million pay-per-view buys or 1.5 million pay-per-view buys, guess what? That's money in my pocket. So you're playing right into Israel Adesanya's hand. I just think it's crazy to suggest anything other than that. I think it's crazy to clutch your pearls at really Adesanya or Du Plessis. And I just think it's exposed a large portion of the MMA fan base. And it just shows truly that racism does exist in the MMA community. Again, it's not everyone. I know I've said that like 4 times, but I know someone's going to take that away from this video, that I'm blaming everyone. But it does exist. And the reason I even have to say it out loud, and the reason I'm even including it and making a video about it, is because no one else is willing to say it. There is not a single person on YouTube or in the MMA media that is willing to say that out loud, and it's easily observable. And I'll be the guy who says it out loud, regardless of the backlash, that I think it's crazy that Adesanya gets all this criticism. Meanwhile, Strickland, Colby, and McGregor get a pass. And that's only 3 I thought of right off the top of my head. There's probably 10 more examples where it could happen. Just because these people align with certain beliefs, they're willing to just give them a pass and defend them and be a sycophant for them. Meanwhile, they're like, oh no, Adesanya, we got to say he's racist and we can't believe he said that. We can't believe he said the C word. Oh my, give me a break. They're promoting a fight. It's ridiculous to suggest anything other than that. They're selling wolf tickets based on a race war, and you guys are eating it up. And it's just disturbing. It's really disturbing that there's really weirdos in the MMA community that absolutely love. They love, oh, there's an MMA fight with a race debate on it. I love this. I can't wait to bash Israel Adesanya because he's a black man. And there's also people on the other side again. They're like, oh, Dricus Du Plessis, he called himself a real African. Let's go after him. And I do understand to a certain extent, but to clutch your pearls and go crazy about any of it, I just think is totally ridiculous. And all you're doing is lining their pockets. So if you don't like Israel Adesanya, don't talk about it anymore. Don't buy the pay-per-view. Go steal it. Do whatever you need to do. But don't sit here and act like Israel Adesanya is some disturbing racist because he said the C word or he called someone my N-word, a white person my N-word. to troll him based on him saying, oh, I am a true, real African champion, and that's what I'll be. That is the end game of Israel Adesanya. He's just trolling him and selling a fight. Let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.